Horror fandom is bursting with debate and conversation. Unanswered questions from their favorite scary movies and franchises. Who is the alien at the end of The Thing? Is a popular unanswerable question made more ludicrous by the fact that thematically the not knowing is the whole point. Was the Overlook Hotel haunted, or were the events a case of insanity brought on by cabin fever? Well, certainly some half-baked conspiracy theorist has some choice words about that one. But one question among the horror community was finally and definitively answered just a few years ago. Is A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 gay? It was certainly seen that way for many years, but the real question was, was it intentional? It seems straightforward to me, but the people involved always danced around it or even outright denied it. The homosexual subtext was something to be openly discussed only by hardcore horror fans and academics who rightly saw this low-budget slasher as a surprising entry into the gay film canon. In 2010, in the documentary Never Sleep Again about the Nightmare series, the screenwriter himself finally confirmed his intentions behind the film.
We've always pussyfooted around this. Look, it was supposed to be subtext. This was post-AIDS, and I started thinking about guys being unsure of their sexuality. And I thought, well, that's pretty scary.
And this really precarious relationship between Mark Patton and I throughout the movie.
You have a board game named Probe on it. He has a sign on the door that says no chicks allowed.
The production designer in the film was gay.
Nightmare on Elm Street 2 rocked Europe because they picked up on the whole psychosexual, homoerotic subtext. Freddy could represent the self-hatred, in the gay community. He could also represent just the taunt.
You son of a bitch!
All this, plus the fact that the protagonist was played by a gay actor, Mark Patton, who brought a little of himself into the role. Even beyond the script, Patton has claimed that the film's gay subtext was increased during production. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is the story of Jesse Walsh, a teenage outsider who begins to have nightmares of a man trying to take over his body. The man, Freddy Krueger, requires Jesse's body to leave the dream world and enter the real world to continue his murderous rampage on the Elm Street children. There are some overt homosexual references, such as when Grady tells Jesse that Coach Snyder is queer and goes to S&M bars. Jesse later goes there himself while in a dazed, almost sleepwalking state. The most obvious homosexual reference, however, is played for laughs.
Something is trying to get inside my body.
Yeah, and she's female and she's waiting for you in the cabana. And you want to sleep with me.
There's a lot going on in the film. A seduction, a fear of who we're becoming, the shaming of parents, and most of it is subtext. But why subtext? Why couldn't A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 be an outwardly gay film in America? Why was this subtext reviled back when it was released? Some horror fans called it the gay sequel. Well, let's take a trip back in time even further. According to The Celluloid Closet, Homosexuality in the Movies by Vito Russo, the censors in the late 20s and early 30s were under pressure from all quarters. In 1926, a Photoplay magazine film critic decried the use of disgusting perverts in Rex Ingram's Mare Nostrum, which featured a vaguely lesbian spy. The arrival of sound brought a new element of realism to the screen, and the watchdogs of the public morality began to bear down on the industry. Will Hayes, a former Postmaster General of the United States and Presbyterian elder, had been enlisted to head the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, an organization created primarily for public relations for the studios and to protect the industry from the threat of outside censorship by institutions like the Catholic Church. By 1930, Hayes developed the Motion Picture Production Code, by which the industry regulated itself. By 1934, the code was strengthened due to outside pressure from the Catholic Legion of Decency. The Legion ranked films as either A. acceptable, B. morally objectionable, or C. condemned. With the Catholic Church and other watchdog groups on their backs, Hollywood promised to abide by the code. Such things that were banned included nudity, profanity, references to abortion, open-mouthed kissing, and of course, sex perversion, which in the 1930s was euphemistic for homosexuality. Screenwriters began to make movies between the lines, and subtext became the only way to make anything even approaching a gay film. Horror had its share. In 1936, Universal Pictures released Dracula's Daughter, featuring a vampire who was coded as a lesbian, but not outright said. Due to the condemnation of homosexuality by the Hays Code, anything remotely gay could only get by the censors if it were the subject of ridicule or fear. By the late 60s, the production code had become difficult to enforce due to changing attitudes, and by 1968, an early version of the rating system we know today was its replacement. Homosexuality was allowed, technically, but in practice it was still regulated to subtext, inference, and characters who were outwardly villainous. According to Monsters in the Closet, Homosexuality in the Horror Film by Harry M. Benshoff, for the first time in film history, openly homosexual characters became commonplace within the genre, sometimes as victims, but more regularly as the monsters themselves. The monsters' violent acts were increasingly defined in overtly queer terms, and perhaps not surprisingly, non-straight sexuality in non-horror films was also defined as monstrous. To have a coded gay character in a horror movie like A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 as both the protagonist and sympathetic was a defiant and surprising act. There is nothing inherently wrong with having the villain character of the story be gay, but it's an altogether different thing to have a character in the story be the villain because he is gay. That their homosexuality is part of why they are cast in a negative light. That this sexuality itself is wrong and must be staked through the heart. It reinforces wrong-headed ideas about homosexuals being predatory. Jesse is struggling with his sexuality, and his sexuality is something that he fears, but he himself is not monstrous. He is kind and sensitive, and has awkward but adorable dance moves. Jesse has become a kind of gay icon, especially in the horror genre that did not have much in the way of gay protagonists at the time. Jesse's struggle with his emerging sexuality is shown in a metaphor by a seductive man both wanting his body and leaping out of his body, taking over. In the narrative, this is terrifying. Freddy Krueger possessing you and forcing you to murder people is horrific. But in terms of the gay subtext itself, why would audiences find this scary? Well, let's contextualize the gay subtext of the film with what was happening in the 1980s and attitudes about homosexuality. In a study in 1984, the year prior to the release of this film, a study of anti-homosexual attitudes was released. Investigators broke down heterosexuals' fears of gay and lesbian sexuality into 3 topic areas. 1. Homosexuality as a threat to the individual, that someone you know, or you yourself, might be homosexual. 2. Homosexuality as a threat to others. Homosexuals have been frequently linked in movies and other media to child molestation, rape, and violence. 3. Homosexuality as a threat to the community and other components of culture. Homosexuals supposedly represent the destruction of the procreative nuclear family, traditional gender roles, and family values. For Americans in the 1980s, and let's face it, many Americans today, there is something monstrous about a homosexual or bisexual, or someone who is transgender, or anything that is not strictly heterosexual and cisgender lurking inside you and striving to get out. A gay nightmare. Queer people rampaging throughout the country, infecting innocent people, searching to destroy Western civilization and the alleged Christian values upon which the country was built. Because of these attitudes, homosexuality was, and in some cases still is, a source of shame, something to be kept in the closet and hidden, a secret. When Jesse begins to act strangely, he hides what is happening from his parents. Jesse's parents operate in the 2 ways that homophobic parents often do: a dual attack of harsh, masculine rejection and condescension under the false disguise of understanding. The former is represented by the father in the film. When Jesse first displays outward signs of trouble, the father ignores this. When he screams in his sleep, Jesse's sister questions this, while the father pretends everything is normal. Later, when strange things start to happen around the house, the father is suspicious of Jesse, even though he has done nothing wrong. The father only gets involved after the signs become too obvious to ignore, and when the rest of the community begins to notice. The father's solution is, as he puts it, a good kick in the butt, asserting traditional masculinity on his son to cure him of what he believes is the problem. The mother is seemingly more supportive, but rather than bonding with her son, she believes he must see a psychiatrist. In both cases, we see examples of the mistaken belief that Jesse can be fixed. Ex-gay therapy, or conversion therapy, is a pseudo-scientific practice of repressing homosexuality and transforming a homosexual into a heterosexual. In addition to this being ineffective, it's also incredibly harmful both to the homosexual in question, but also to society at large, as the mere existence of the pseudoscience reinforces the idea that homosexuality is deviant or immoral and must be expunged and cured. In 1985, when A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 was released, it had only been a little over a decade since homosexuality was removed as a listed mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association. Of course, most people don't have a copy of the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the mistaken belief continued for a long time in the general public. In fact, it's only been recent that legislation in America has begun to be passed to outlaw conversion therapy as a form of abuse. The context of Jesse's parents being concerned about him is that these fears, mixed with ignorance, were standard among families of the time, and even some families to this day. In the film, Jesse has been infected by Freddy Krueger. He can't get him out of his body. Homosexuality as a kind of infection grew as a concept among Americans during the AIDS crisis. Charles Kaiser, author of The Gay Metropolis, wrote, "Homophobia led many decision-makers to discount this epidemic, partly because they didn't care much about those who were sick, and partly because they believed that as long as they were straight, they themselves would never have to worry about it." The Congressional Research Service estimated that the National Institutes of Health had spent $36,100 per toxic shock death in fiscal 1982, $34,841 per Legionnaire's disease death, and just $3,225 per AIDS death in fiscal 1981 and $8,991 in fiscal 1982. Congressional staffers joked that NIH really stood for Not Interested in Homosexuals. The aforementioned book, Monsters in the Closet, references Jesse's soaked appearance as resembling night sweats among AIDS patients, though that appears to be just happenstance. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 doesn't only depict fear among the gay community about threats from outside, but internalized homophobia and shame. In one scene, Jesse meets up with Coach Snyder at a bar by accident. Schneider makes Jesse run laps while he watches, and then tells Jesse to hit the showers. Freddy, through Jesse, binds and then murders the naked coach. The scene feels like a metaphorical gay panic attack. Jesse, having been aroused by the possibility of a sexual encounter with the coach, murders him rather than admit to his feelings. Shortly after an intimate moment between Jesse and Grady, Freddy reemerges stronger than ever and lays waste to Jesse's closest male friend. As the embodiment of Jesse's internalized homophobia, Freddy keeps Jesse from indulging in homosexual acts. When Jesse and his girlfriend are about to have sex, rather than kill her, Freddy tries to participate in the sexual act. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is an iconic gay film, even though most of the gay content is beneath the surface and could be denied by the screenwriter. In fact, he denied it for years, and enough people believed him. We are decades after the removal of the Hays Code, and representation has gotten better, but it still has a ways to go. A 2018 report by GLAAD found that only about 12% of the 109 major studio releases it tracked last year had even a single LGBT character, which was down significantly from the year prior. One would think things would get better every year, but that's not always the case. Most gay films are independently made and therefore do not receive wide releases. You know what would be a great way to have more gay representation in film with little risk to studios? Make more gay horror movies. Due to the combination of low budgets and willingness of audiences to see horror movies sight unseen, the horror genre is the lowest risk for a major studio. Horror is as close to bulletproof as it gets. Why not more horror movies with gay protagonists? If Hollywood studios want to dip their toes into gay content, but also get a little nervous about their bottom lines, horror is the least risky way to do it. There have been a host of gay horror films of late, but they aren't coming out of big American studios. They're coming from Europe, or from the American independent scene where few Americans will see them, and it's important to see people who differ from yourself. Familiarity breeds acceptance, and lack of representation reinforces negative traits and othering of people. That's critical right now, as LGBT Americans are facing a backlash under the current administration. We shouldn't have to sift through subtext to find our gay icons, horror or otherwise. But until things get better on that front, I guess we always have a Nightmare on Elm Street too. I have an affection for it, not only because of the strong performances and its inclusion in my favorite slasher series, but also because it's a rare case of a mainstream Hollywood horror franchise having an undeniably gay entry. Frankly, it's like finding a unicorn. Hi everyone, thanks for watching The Gay Nightmare. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and click on that Patreon link to support the show. Also, click the notification bell if you subscribe, that way you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.